Hi, good evening, everyone. I know 5 minutes late isn't Jewish time, but we'll try and we have a lot to cover tonight. Thank you for joining our evening to discuss addiction and substance abuse, understanding the landscape and its impact on us. Just a very few brief comments before we introduce our panel and jump into the substance. First off, if I could ask people to please silence their cell phones so we don't have interruptions, appreciate it. This panel presentation is a result of your feedback from our April awareness event. The community wanted more community education. The feedback we got back in April highlighted three areas. One, support for loved ones. So we started a support group. We now have a support group for loved ones of sufferers from addiction that meets every other week and unfortunately is well attended. The second area was around the schools. Your feedback said they wanted the schools to focus on this issue around curricula and policy in a more uniform way. And so we have an initiative that we started with local middle schools and high schools around policies and curricula. We received a grant from an affiliate of SAMHSA to help us with that. So we've gotten kind of some free help around that, and that initiative is well underway. And then the third area of feedback was around more community education, and that's what brought us here. I also just wanted to point out that as a direct result of April's awareness event, there was an event tonight halfway around the world in El Azhar, in the Gush, around addiction awareness. There was somebody there who heard about our April awareness event, how successful it was, reached out to us, and worked with Amudim to put together an awareness event there. So the impact that our community really leading on this issue is having is worldwide. This evening is presented by Communities Confronting Substance Abuse, a new organization we formed to continue these initiatives in the community. And we're partnering with the RCBC and all of our area day schools and high schools. We have a number of corporate sponsors that we are incredibly thankful for providing us with financial and logistical support. I want to mention them all. Cinch Deliveries, Chopsticks, Congregation Keter Torah, Englewood Hospital and Medical Center, 5-Star Caterers, Hudson Regional Hospital, Ma'adan Catering, NCSY, Overlook Pain and Recovery, and the Valley Hospital. Thank you to all of those sponsors. I want to especially thank the health organizations that are sponsoring us who have expressed a strong desire to continue working with us as we continue to roll out additional initiatives throughout the community. Many of our sponsors have materials in the back. The table is set out in the atrium. Please, please, please feel free to pick some of those materials up on your way out. And there's just one thing I want to mention specifically. There is a flyer out there around free Narcan training that is being provided by Englewood Health. For those of you who don't know, Narcan is an opioid overdose reversal agent. Dr. Schulman, you'll tell me if I got that wrong.
Keep going.
Okay.
You're good.
It saves lives. And unfortunately, we know this firsthand. Our daughter has actually witnessed people having their lives saved with Narcan. So for those of you for whom it's appropriate, I encourage you to pick up that flyer and participate in that Narcan training. There's still a gap in the funding for the event despite all those great sponsors. And as a result, there are envelopes on your chairs and more in the back for people to drop off or send in contributions to help defray the cost of this event and help in our community in education initiatives and our initiatives with the local schools. To the extent you are able, there are boxes in the back where you can leave a donation, checks, cash, whatever, or you can mail it in. We greatly appreciate it. Couple of thank yous. First, there have been a number of people, a large number of people who helped with tonight's event, but in particular I want to call out a couple of people. Rochelle Zomick and Livia Weisinger were foolish enough to offer their help after the April event. Apparently they don't know Leanne well enough to know that when you open your mouth like that, no good deed goes unpunished. So thank you to Livia and Rochelle for their countless hours and tireless efforts in helping bring this together. And of course, I need to thank Leanne, who really was the organizational mastermind behind this event. And the last thank you is really to our daughter, Ilana. It is really her bravery and her willingness to have her story told back in April that has started this tsunami of activity that brings us here tonight. Really, we all owe her a thank you for helping bring these issues to the forefront in our community. Okay, so here's the format for tonight. We've gotten in over 50 questions by email and through the website, which is incredible, and they're great questions. We also have index cards sitting on each of your chairs. We are not going to take questions from the audience verbally. However, we do encourage you to ask questions, write them on the index cards, and raise your hands. We have runners back there, raise your hands, young ladies there, who will be available to pick up those cards and bring them up to us, and we'll try to get to as many of the questions as we can tonight. We may not get to them all, but we're going to try to get to as many as we can. Our goal is to wrap up the evening by about 9 o'clock tonight. Also on your chairs are feedback cards. Those feedback cards are really, really important to us. We urge you to fill them out. There's a box in the back. Please fill them out and give us your feedback so we can make sure that we are meeting the needs of the community. Finally, just a note, we have a cameraman from NBC here who is going to be filming, so if you see someone with a camera roaming around, don't worry. Part of a documentary that they are producing in furtherance of the piece that was on the NBC National News, and I'm sure many of you saw a couple of weeks ago. So with that, I'd like to introduce this esteemed panel that I'm honored to moderate. And I'm going to start to my immediate left and then go down the row. Shelley Stewart, who's with the Center for Alcohol and Drug Resources here in New Jersey. With a degree in public health, Shelley Stewart has been in the field of prevention for over 13 years. Beginning her career in coordinated school health planning and implementing youth leadership trainings with middle and high schools, Ms. Stewart built a strong foundation to organize wellness teams and make policy changes within the schools around the components of the CDC's whole school, whole community, whole child model. In her current position, Ms. Stewart is the Director of Coalition and Community Services at the Center for Alcohol and Drug Resources in Fair Lawn, New Jersey. In this role, she oversees the Garfield, New Jersey Prevention Coalition, which is a drug-free communities grantee, as well as the Bergen County Prevention Coalition, a regional coalition funded through the New Jersey Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. The BCPC does work in all 70 of Bergen County's communities. Thank you for being here, Shelley. Next to Shelley, we have Special Agent Timothy P. McMahon. Special Agent McMahon has been employed by the Drug Enforcement Administration since October 1998. Prior to becoming a special agent with the DEA, he spent 6 years as a trooper with the New York State Police from October 92 through October 98. Special Agent McMahon has been assigned to the enforcement and task force groups, served as the Special Agent Recruiter for New Jersey, and is currently assigned as the Public Information Officer and Demand Reduction Coordinator for DEA's New Jersey Division. Special Agent McMahon earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree in English from St. Bonaventure University. Thank you for being here, Special Agent McMahon. Next to Special Agent McMahon, we have Dr. Matis Schulman. Dr. Schulman is an addiction psychiatry research fellow at Columbia University Medical Center. He's the author of numerous articles and book chapters on the topics of addiction and general psychiatric treatment. He attended New Jersey Medical School and completed a general psychiatry residency at Northwell Health Hospital System on Long Island and an addiction psychiatry fellowship at Columbia University. In addition to his work at Columbia, Dr. Schulman maintains a private practice here in Teaneck, New Jersey, where he treats patients for addiction and other psychiatric conditions. Next to Dr. Schulman is Rabbi Larry Rothwax. Rabbi Rothwax has served as rabbi at Congregation Beth Aaron in Teaneck, New Jersey since August 2002. Rabbi Rothwax, known to many of you, I'm going to skip a lot of this, Rabbi Rothwax. I hope that's not out of lack of respect, but Rabbi Rothwax currently serves as Director of Professional Rabbinics at Reeds at Yeshiva University. On April 22nd, 2018, Rabbi Rothwax addressed a standing room only crowd in Teaneck, New Jersey as part of an awareness and education event that I mentioned before. Rabbi Rothwax is also a frequent contributor of articles to the Jewish Link, written on many topics, and hopefully many of you saw his article this past Friday, which I thought was incredibly powerful. And finally, next to Rabbi Rothwax, Rabbi Tully Hardstark. Rabbi Hardstark is the founding principal of SAR High School. He previously served as rabbi of this shul, Congregation Keter Torah, and as the associate principal of Judaic Studies at SAR Academy. Rabbi Hardstark is the co-founder of Davar Unique Learning Community in Teaneck, New Jersey. He was a fellow at the Tikva Center for Law and Jewish Civilization at NYU Law School in 2010-11. He also was a recipient of the 2017 Covenant Award for Jewish Educators. Rabbi Hardstark has spearheaded programs related to substance abuse in our community and has worked extensively on developing more effective communication between schools and families regarding this issue. So again, thank you all for joining me here today. It's an incredible panel. So what we're going to try and do is group some of the questions that we've gotten into some groups that kind of have some common themes. And what I'm going to do is turn a series of questions over to one of our panelists in the first instance, but really encourage all of our panelists to weigh in on all of these issues. So the first group of questions is really around drug availability. And some of the questions that have come in: what does legalization of marijuana mean for New Jersey? Will it be available in local stores? Will my kids be able to get it online? How accessible are drugs? What is law enforcement doing about it? I've heard that you can buy a bag of heroin for $5 or less in nearby New Jersey towns. Is this true? How do you put a stop to it? And then what is fentanyl? Why is it so dangerous? Is it more addictive than other drugs? So for this series of questions around drug availability, from everything from marijuana all the way through to fentanyl, I'm going to turn it over in the first instance to Special Agent McMahon.
Okay, thank you very much. Just going down the list, what does the legalization of marijuana mean for New Jersey? That's kind of a loaded question. Now, it looks like that's the way things are going to be going. At some point, it looks like it's definitely going to be legalized here within the state. Just going off of what we have seen in other states where it has already been legalized recreationally, a lot of the issues that have come up is obviously underage use. Although when it is legalized, it'll be that the law will state 21 and over. But in states like Colorado, where it's already been legalized, since it's been legalized, Colorado high school students are #1 in the nation for marijuana usage. And that was since it's been legalized. It just seems to be, although there's an age limit on it, we can take a look at how well that works with alcohol. It seems like that's definitely going to be a concern that we're going to have to keep an eye on here in New Jersey if and when the time comes that it is legalized. Increase in motor vehicle accidents from people under the influence of marijuana. Again, we're seeing that in the other states where it's already been legalized. Not just within the states where it's been legalized, but in surrounding states. People from neighboring states driving into the states where it's legal to purchase and use marijuana legally, and then getting in their vehicles and driving back to their, across the border to their states, and getting into motor vehicle accidents across the border as well. So those are just a couple of the issues that it looks like we're going to be facing, the same type of issues that many of the other states have. What some towns here in New Jersey have already started doing, they've started passing local ordinances forbidding the opening of the state authorized stores for when it does become legal. So that is a step that different communities can take across the state as preventive measures before it does become legalized. We're seeing that in other states also where it has been legalized, that they're also taking those same types of steps. Will it be available in local stores? Once it's legalized, it will only be available in state authorized and state licensed stores. You know, you or I wouldn't be able to just open up a store and start selling it. Places are going to have to apply for state licenses, and those will be the only places that'll be authorized. And then will my kids be able to get it online? It's my understanding that it will not be available online, at least when it becomes legal. Obviously, today with the illegal narcotics, with utilization of the dark web on the internet, people are purchasing illegal narcotics that way through the internet, but it wouldn't be once it's legalized.
Just curious, Rabbi Hartsock, if you have any thoughts as a head of school on what legalized marijuana in a neighboring state for your school might mean, or if you've given any thought to that.
I think we certainly have been giving thought to it, not exactly sure what to do about it, but the concern and hearing the description of teens in Colorado, as you just described, is exactly our worst fear. As the print will say that it's only legal at a certain age, but if it's out there and more readily available, kids are going to figure out a way to get it, and that's an issue of real concern. And I think that kind of speaks to the need for a collective effort. I think one of the things I'm going to try to speak to later is what's the role of schools, and is it only focused on what's happening within the school walls and on the property or beyond? I think that this is an issue, and that kind of question speaks to the importance of it. We're all in this together, in the school and outside the boundaries of the school, and figuring out how to make that into a purposeful collective effort, I think, is the key challenge.
Any other panelists? Dr. Schulman, anything to add around this issue?
Well, from a medical perspective, just some facts to sort of add on. In states where marijuana is legalized, we know the marijuana use disorder has gone up, so it's going to become more of a problem. There are people that are not using marijuana right now that will use and eventually end up with use disorder, so they'll need treatment. So we need to figure out ways to get more treatment, from my perspective. There have been some benefits, which I should just sort of possible benefits, I should say, with regards to decreased opiate use. Some people are using maybe less opiates for pain, which is probably a more dangerous drug. So I want to be I guess it shouldn't all be considered a rainy day or black cloud. With regards to schools, I think I agree that we really need to have a communal approach. I think ways of screening and monitoring and then deciding who needs treatment and find the treatment. I think the community should get together and figure out a way to do that. I think that's really important.
Special Agent McMahon, you want to turn to the questions around some of the opiates, heroin and fentanyl, and what's going on there?
Sure. One of the questions I've heard, you can buy a bag of heroin for $5 or less in nearby New Jersey towns. Is this true? And how do you put a stop to this? That is absolutely true. Unfortunately, here in the state of New Jersey, what we're seeing is, well, not just in New Jersey, but across the country, about 75% of new heroin users started out first by abusing the prescription painkillers. And when it gets to the point where people that are abusing the pills no longer have that free accessibility at home, either leftovers in the medicine cabinet, their next option is purchasing it on the street. What we're seeing is a 30 milligram tablet on average will sell for $30, $1 a milligram. Once that addiction and that dependence kicks in, it's no longer just taking 1 or 2 pills a day. That amount increases, and at $30 a piece, that gets very expensive. That same $30 for 1 pill can buy you 8 bags, 7 bags of heroin here in New Jersey, in this area. And unfortunately, in New Jersey, we have the purest heroin in the country. On average, from what we see from our the samples we send to our lab for testing, about 60% purity level. And it's basically because of where we're located. We have the accessibility through the major airports in the area, the highway system, the ports in Newark and Elizabeth. So when the illegal narcotics are coming here to this area, they're coming straight here from the source country, which now most of the time is Mexico. So when it arrives here, it's already arriving in its purest form. And unfortunately, as I said, it's extremely, extremely cheap, making it very, very appealable to people. Let's see, how do we put a stop to this? DEA, state police, local law enforcement, county, we're all working together. At our office in Newark, we have various task forces where we have state and local law enforcement assigned to us. We're going after the drug trafficking organizations. DEA is international as well. So our main goal is to go after and dismantle these organizations, from the people selling on the street corner all the way up to the heads of the organizations in the foreign countries. Seems it is a daunting task. Again, just because the amounts that are coming in, you know, when you picture one of those container ships pulling into the port in Newark with 1,000 containers on it, it's impossible to search every one of them. They do random spot checks, and if we receive information on a particular container that may contain something, those will be searched. Same thing with drug organizations throughout the area. Obviously, we're doing our investigations. State and locals are doing their investigations, and we're trying to have as big of an impact as we can.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
I'm sorry?
In conversation with someone who does drug testing professionally, you mentioned numerous times that the potency of the marijuana that's available today is much stronger than 10, 20, 30 years ago. Is that something that you would, is that accurate?
Yes. Again, when it comes to marijuana, and I go out and I do a lot of educational programs across the state speaking with parents, and a lot of parents have the attitude either themselves smoke marijuana when they were younger or their parents smoke marijuana, they turned out fine, what's the big deal? The marijuana of today is not the same as the marijuana of 1970s and 1980s. It has a much higher THC concentration. THC is the ingredient of marijuana that gets somebody high. For somebody to say, oh, it's no big deal, it's just marijuana, again, it's just not the same as it was a number of years ago.
All right, let's shift. Well, 2 words on fentanyl, just because that word is used a lot, and I just want to make sure we address that briefly at least.
Dealing with fentanyl, for those not familiar, used medically, usually for people that are terminal, in extreme pain, given in a skin patch a lot of times, so it's very slowly absorbed into the skin. Could be 50 to 80 times more potent than morphine. That has now found its way into the heroin supply. It's being manufactured clandestinely in China. That's where we're seeing where most of the fentanyl is coming in from. And the drug organizations are mixing it in with the heroin. 2 milligrams is usually enough to be a fatal dose. And what is 2 milligrams? When you're home, put a little salt in your palm, take your thumb and index finger, see how much you can squeeze between those 2 fingers. That's more than what a fatal dose of fentanyl would be. Why would people that are using heroin continue to use it knowing that that's possibly in there? Because they're looking to get the best high possible. Every now and again we hear about these clusters of overdoses over a couple-day period where maybe 60, 70 or more people overdose in a 2-day period. For you and I, it would be, well, we're staying away from that area. For the people that are addicted, it would actually bring more people into that area looking to try that type of heroin. Because although in their mind they know all those people overdosed, in their mind the high is going to be that good that they want to try and experience it. And that's in large part due to fentanyl.
Interesting question actually that came in from the audience relating to this topic. And Robert Rothbachs, maybe you can take a crack at this one. Or anyone really. Is our community lobbying to prevent marijuana from becoming legal, like we lobby for Israel, school security, etc.? Is there any, how do you feel as a communal leader or anyone on the panel around lobbying efforts? And maybe Shelley, I don't know if you're aware of anything going on that front as well.
So as a recipient of federal and state funding, I don't have the privilege of being able to lobby, but there are people who work with and amongst my colleagues who do lobby. Unfortunately, the lobbyists that are working for the large pharmaceutical companies have much higher paid lobbyists than the people who are working for nonprofit agencies. So we're often up against these large conglomerate businesses who have very expensive lobbyists who are working to counter the lobbying that's being done to prevent these things.
Any thoughts from anyone else on this issue?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any efforts, at least locally, to lobby and try to either stall or halavai, just completely prevent the legalization of marijuana in New Jersey. Just to go back to something you said earlier, because I think this is the likely scenario, as we just heard, is that it will ultimately become legal. There does seem to be sort of a wave that is taking place in the entire Western world, and it does seem as if it's a matter of time. And without, without completely dismissing the suggestion that we lobby, I think we need to try to give as much thought as we can as to what the culture is in our community regarding marijuana. And if we take a look at alcohol as an example, one of the things that I have mentioned in the past, I believe I mentioned this at the event back in April, is that we do tend to have, when I say we, I mean we in this room, in this community, in our otherwise very wonderful community here in Bergen County, we have a very tolerant attitude towards alcohol. Now, alcohol and substances that we're discussing tonight are completely 2 different topics, But when we do hear about either children or adults who struggle with alcoholism or run into trouble that they can't necessarily overcome, we need to understand that these sort of issues are not created in a vacuum, and the permissive, tolerant, and sometimes culturally encouraged atmosphere, which is very often the case in our community. So if it doesn't create the problem, it certainly makes it more complicated to address. And if we want to be successful in at least stemming the effects of the tide of the legalization of marijuana, I think before it's too late, we should really give serious questions as to the way we view, alcohol as well as marijuana. Because as was just mentioned, there is an attitude that many of our children are exposed to, and at least some of them claim they're picking up at home, at their friends' homes, that marijuana is really not all that bad, and it's not going to kill anybody. And sometimes it actually could make life a little more manageable. And you know what? And you'll take my word for it, I've never inhaled. It could be true. It could be true. But it's irrelevant if we're going to have a serious conversation about this, because we also know that the risks are real, and we see the effects of them. So sometimes you have to give up pleasures in life in order to achieve greater good.
Yep.
If I could add to that, we know, I don't know if anybody remembers, a few years ago there was an ad, late night TV. It was one of those public service announcements that didn't seem to get primetime playment, but it was 15/7/21, and the 7 is it's disputable, but it was basically saying that young people who with the onset of any kind of substance, whether it's tobacco, alcohol, or other drugs, who initiated before the age of 15 were 7, and some say 5, but significantly higher risk of addiction than those who waited until the legal age of 21 to try those things. So I think it's important to note that as an adult making a decision to drink alcohol or even to smoke marijuana, should it become legal, it's much different than a young person who at 15 or even less than that, 13, is initiating these mind-altering substances. Their risk of addiction is so much higher than somebody who waited to initiate until they were a legal adult.
So I want to shift focus a little bit now. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I want to make sure we don't skip one point, because I'm worried it could save someone's life. We were talking before the program started about fentanyl and how it's processed and packaged. So it's not only packaged in heroin. Do you want to talk? Maybe you want to just say, because I think you know more details than I do.
Sure.
Just if kids are on the street and they're offered a pill, or they're at a party and offered a pill, just what it could happen.
Again, the drug organizations, they're all about making money. So when it gets to the point where somebody is going out and purchasing the pills illegally on the street, some of these drug organizations are taking the heroin and fentanyl mixture and pressing them into pills with the same stamps that legitimate pharmaceuticals have on them, making them very difficult to detect as copies. So somebody thinks they're buying an OxyContin tablet on the street could actually be buying a tablet of heroin and fentanyl and have no idea. So again, the person who's looking to buy on the street, it really is today playing a game of Russian roulette, because you really have no idea what it is that you might be getting.
Thank you. No, thanks for bringing that up. So let's shift focus a little bit. We had a little bit of discussion around the schools, but there were a lot of questions that came in around the schools. And so just a number of the questions that have come in, and some have come in tonight as well. What are the schools doing about the issues around substance abuse and addiction? Are the schools' policies too harsh? Are they effective? Is it fair for a school to punish a student for something that happens off premises? Do you think expelling students or giving extended suspensions is an effective way to address the rising concern of drug use, especially juuling? What should happen to these children at risk? Why are the schools taking zero tolerance policies? So a number of kind of similarly themed questions around the schools. And I will tell you as a parent, certainly until very recently, when this dialogue has started, there's been a lot of confusion around what the school's policies are. And Rabbi Hartzog, I know you're only the head of school of one school, but if you could talk to some of these issues in the first instance.
Sure. I think on one level I can only talk about my own school, but on another level there's been a lot of discussion cross-institution in general over recent years, and particularly over the past year. And I think it's right that the first thing I'd like to do is just clarify a couple of things. First of all, I think that one really important sign of progress, and is one way in which I think the world has changed, is that there's real public acknowledgement in institutions that this is an issue that requires focus and is talked about openly. Certainly it's different than it was 25 years ago when you didn't want to say it out loud. It's different than it was 10 years ago, and I think schools were able to say, yeah, there are kids in our school who are smoking pot or drinking, but I just hope that we're not the worst ones. I think that now it's progressed to saying this is something that requires our collective leverage. Like, we really have to work together to figure out how to be able to take this on. And I think that's really important. I do think that in terms of what the school's focus is, and the point of that schools tend to be addressing for the most part, requires clarification in order to understand the policies. And for that, I think we need to make a distinction between the abuse of substances and the use of substances. And the abuse that requires treatment, and the use which we would be best served to create prevention measures so that that kind of use does not spread. The reason why that's important is because school policies are for sure focused on use and prevention, not on abuse and treatment. And the reason why that's important is, without question, cross-institution. If, God forbid, someone is a student is suffering from addiction or some extreme circumstance which has kind of crossed a line, and even well before that, the disposition, the orientation of the schools, and in this I can speak about all schools, and what I mean by all schools, I'll speak in a moment about a policy letter that 25 schools across the United States, yeshiva high schools, I'm saying, signed, with shared commitments in terms of what the policies were. When someone is struggling, the approach is to be able to support the family, to provide counseling, to figure out how to be able to help the student manage. The kinds of, and I should say that there was a letter, maybe some or many of you read it when it went out a number of months ago. Again, that was signed by principals across the country. And it was a policy letter, and essentially the policy described as follows. It said that any student who's struggling from substance use, alcohol or drugs, will be, the school's approach will be to provide support and to be able to help the student and the family. And the severe line is any student who brings substances onto school property or to a school program can be subject to expulsion. And in thinking about where that's coming from, that is not a focus on addiction and managing addiction. That is saying that there's a school culture, and the school's responsibility is to provide a safe space for all of its students, and bringing substances into the school space, wherever that might be, is an aggressive act against the school environment, and that can't be. And a student needs to understand, and when that's happening, I want to be clear that when the school is tackling that, that's a circumstance, in my experience, that 100% of my experiences, when that's happening, that's about a student who is kind of making an aggressive move against the environment. And that requires a response. And so the general school policy is divided in that way. Support for students when they're struggling, and when a student does something that is going to hurt the community, then schools should take a strong response. Different schools will manage that differently, and can respond to questions around that. In terms of what schools are doing, given the acknowledgement of this as an issue and that general orientation, I think that schools divide between establishing certain policies, as you just said, providing certainly better education than we did in the past. I think that there are, and here I am speaking just from my own school, we have an extensive health curriculum for students in the 10th grade, and then there's another round which takes a little bit of a different shape in the 12th grade. There's opportunity for kids to learn and talk about in a very straight up way the things that they need to know, and to be able to ask the questions that they need to ask, and to have speakers who can come and present. And I think that both in terms of the policy and in terms of the education, we're doing better than we were doing before, although in all of this, I think we can always do better.
So I just want to comment on that for 1 second. One of the things I mentioned earlier that we're working on with the SAMHSA grant that we got is around policy and curriculum going back to the middle school. So one of the things that we're very focused on, and every one of the area middle schools has signed on to this and is participating in this initiative, is to really help to develop, ideally, our dream is a uniform social emotional curriculum that includes, as on an age-appropriate basis, education and curriculum around substance use that builds on itself. So hopefully when these kids, because our research, the research will tell you, and our personal experience was that these issues start in middle school. They often start in middle school. And so if we can do that, and we can get the kids coming out of 8th grade who come into the high schools on a base level of education around that social emotional curriculum, again, I think our goal would then be for the high schools to take it from there and continue to build on that. And I know that's something Rabbi Hartstock is committed to working on and has been working with a number of schools on as well.
Yes, although if I could add one thing, I think there is another area which needs to be noted as separate from policy and from education. I think that the reality is that adolescents, when they're at that moment where they need to make a decision whether they're going to drink or not drink, or smoke or not smoke, and the setting, if you can kind of imagine what that setting is, when they're first crossing that line, you'd like to hope, and maybe for some it is true that the education and the policy, by education means appealing to kids' ability to say, like, I know what's right and what's wrong, I know what's healthy and what isn't, I'm going to make the right decision. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't happen. And policy, the same thing. Policy can be helpful because students can say, I might do this, but I can blame my school or my parents because the policy is such that I'm going to get in serious trouble if I cross this line, and so I won't. But I don't think that both of those are enough. I think that there's a culture-building enterprise that we need to build as a community that extends beyond policies and beyond education. Something along the lines of, if you can help imagine, what mothers did, or the Mothers Against Drunk Driving campaign, or the campaign against smoking in public, something which is public health oriented, which is different than policy, different than deterrence. It's about shifting culture, and that's some of what we've been trying to spend time figuring out how to do. That's a third prong, and that's the area that demands the most collaboration between school, community, and parents, and I think that that's extremely important for us to invest energy in.
Other comments?
I just want to add one thing, and that is that there have been incidents, and there likely will continue to be, where schools do need to take a very hard line, as we just heard. And while I don't disagree with the policy, and I do agree that there needs to be a line in the sand, and perhaps, and I will agree at the moment that if a student brings drugs into school, then that should be a violation that has a very significant consequence, which may include expulsion or a very long-term suspension. I do think that the community as a whole, and that may include individual schools or the schools as a group, as a pact, need to figure out what we then do to further help that child and that family manage their new life. Because the way it seems to me anyway, that it would often play out now, is that a kid who doesn't necessarily have the ability, as Rabbi Hartstock just said, to say, wait a second, I really shouldn't be doing this, and stop himself, because there are kids that, for whatever reason, will cross that line, will get caught, and then what? I don't necessarily think that it's the responsibility of the school that has been put in that position and had their hand forced that needs to take on this responsibility by themselves, but I think the community has the resources and the minds, and I hope the will, to be able to figure out what happens what are we going to do to secure the future of this child, his physical health, it's not only his, it could be her emotional and religious health, and when the time is right, how can such a child be reintegrated into our system?
I agree with what you're saying, but I think it's important also to add that more often than not, that line that's crossed at the moment where the student brings something or does something that crosses that line, that's not where the story began. The story, more often than not, started before that in some context, and often it's a context where kids know about what's happening with a particular student, or it could be that there are parents who know what's happening with a given student, and we suffer from, for kids, the greatest violation. I mean, this is not the 11th commandment, this is probably the first commandment for kids, is you don't tell on your friends about anything. And that's natural, it's natural adolescent behavior, but not something that we should just accept. But I understand it honestly more than I understand parents who know things that are going on and with their children's friends or their own children or something where they were, and don't bring a school in to say, we need to work on this together, because that backdrop, that getting started early is very important in order to ensure a collaborative effort. Otherwise, you're starting at that most heated moment, and that's really difficult.
So I have two comments to that I want to raise. Number one, what I've heard from some community members is that there's a trepidation to bring the school into it because there isn't predictability around how the schools are going to react. So there's not comfort. A parent, think about a parent who's got a child who they know is using. And they are faced with the dilemma. Do they go tell the school and risk that their child's going to be suspended, expelled, outed, the next topic of Shabbos conversations for the next month? Or is the school going to be compassionate? And they just don't know the answer to that question, is what I've heard. What are the schools doing about that would be, I think, an important thing to share.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that there's reason for there to be confusion around how schools would respond. I would say that if a parent would approach a school not in the context of any event and say, this is what's going on for my child, I would say that, I don't know that I can say every single school, but I actually think every school would say, we want to work with you. When a student crosses a line and is raising it when there's something happened in my house. There was an event that happened in my house and kids came, that's much more complicated, and I agree that generates confusion. Meaning I'm not trying to say schools are doing it neatly and they know exactly what they do. I'm only saying that I think that the institutions in dealing with the issue on its own want to be compassionate, and I think that when we wait until something happened, it becomes much more complicated because there are more people involved and other students involved, and that makes it harder.
Okay, I would just say, in my experience, I would absolutely agree that there is a lot of trepidation and concern, and for full disclosure, I sometimes have hesitated before advising parents what and when and how they should communicate with the school, and I say that with great regret. I would agree with Rabbi Hargstag that all of the heads of school in my dealings are very compassionate, and everyone really ultimately wants what's in the best interest of all the kids. I just want to say something else, and that is that we can't speak about these schools or the heads of school and the administrations and those who are making these decisions as if they are the only ones who are pushing back on the kids. The way I see it, the community as a whole, the parents are putting a lot of pressure on the schools. There is a lot of competition in our community. This is actually the season. If Rabbi Harkstad were not here right now, probably he would be, did you have your open house meeting? Yeah. Open house, parlor meeting. And the competition in our community is a beautiful thing. We've all benefited in many ways from it, but it has reached, in my opinion, and I think many agree, and we see this in different levels, a level of unhealthy competition. The pressure that is imagined and real, and probably a combination of both, that is placed on the heads of school and the admissions committee to to pull together the dream class of 2022 or 2023 puts them in some very, very difficult positions when trying to process and filter information that's coming in their way. So I think we all need to do a cheshbon nefesh over here. It's not, you know, at the end of the day, the heads of school are our, I mean, to be frank, just as I am, they are employees of the community, but more importantly, that they are serving us. And we need to be very careful and thoughtful and deliberate in terms of how we communicate to each other about what we want and what we really, and manage our own expectations about what sort of school we are going to send our children to. We're going to be wonderful, wonderful schools that are not going to be perfect. Many wonderful students and some with struggles. And we have to be okay with that.
One very quick informational question that was asked. Are these Yeshiva high schools doing drug testing? Should there be a unified policy around drug testing? Just curious if you can comment on that for a moment.
Drug testing is a very, it's a complicated business. I think that when we did research on the kind of drug testing that were most, it's very hard, let's say, there are schools which do drug testing that are not, I'll try this one more time. In order for it to work, you need to know exactly how much time can elapse from the time that someone used a substance and the kind of test that you're employing. And it has to be really random. And there are a lot of choices out there in terms of what kind of test works for what. In my estimation, the kind of drug testing that we're doing right now in yeshivot actually doesn't really serve its purpose. It might serve as some kind of deterrent, but it's actually not really testing. And I think that if it's going to work, it has to be random in a very, very thoughtful and precise kind of way. If we were all doing it across the board in the right way, it would be a big investment of money, but maybe that would be an interesting idea. But it would be a big project, not just making the decision to do it.
I actually want to add on that note that with technology, I'm interested in technology and substance research. There are ways that, I was actually talking to someone recently about, perhaps we could use some centralized app-based drug testing system that might work for the school, so maybe we'll be able to figure it out. But I wanted to ask you something.
Yeah.
Before we move on, we were talking a little bit about how the community reacts when someone isn't doing well. And I know we've talked about this before, and I actually got into addiction psychiatry a little bit. I started out as a rabbi, actually, because I worked with some of the people that were on the fringe and that were not succeeding in the community and not sort of the golden child of the community. And they were all using drugs and alcohol. So how sort of you felt when you were struggling with your daughter's sort of situation, and how you, and I guess to maybe start the conversation about how we react to people that aren't fitting in the way, or the expectations that we have and the things that we want. And
Sure. I mean, I'll address it with a comment that actually Ilana made to the press back in April, which was the first time we had heard it. You learn so much about your children when you let reporters interview them. And she said to us, gee, I just felt like there was no one I could talk to. I felt like I didn't fit in school. What was going on there didn't talk to me, and I felt alone and that there was no one to talk to. She felt she didn't have a resource to talk to about these things, both whatever social emotional issues are going on with her, as well as when addiction started to rear its, or use, which led to addiction, started to rear its ugly head. So I do think that we have a habit in our high-achieving community to let those kids kind of fall through the cracks, and we don't necessarily give them the avenues that they all need. I'm not suggesting that our schools are not focused on these things with guidance, with mental health counseling, all of those things. We've come a long way in that respect. But we as a community have had a hard time, I think, recognizing that we have members in our community who just don't feel a part of our community. And rather than embracing them, I think we have a tendency to, I don't want to say ignore, but perhaps not pay as much attention. So I think that's how I would answer that question. I think that that's one of the major reasons why we embarked on this, because when we were dealing with it, I remember, we were kind of like, wow, this community's amazing. Nobody else has a drug problem. No one talks about this. It's incredible. We must be the only ones. And clearly we knew that wasn't the case. And I think a first step to our community embracing people and really working to bring them, and the first step really is for them to feel a part of the community. If they feel a part of the community, it's a lot easier to reach them and help them with their issues, is my sense. So that's what, from my perspective at least, this is all about. Interesting, I want to move on from schools, but just a couple of quick ones. And this is an interesting one. Even if a middle school child is helped by the school with compassion, the way you describe, will that child be able to gain admission to a local yeshiva high school? And by the way, I've heard this question not just about the child, but their siblings. And so what we've heard is that there is tremendous reticence on the part of middle school students to talk to the schools about any of these issues, because they know the middle schools talk to the high schools. Again, Rabbi Rothwachs talked about the competitive nature, and they're deathly petrified of the impact it's going to have on that child and their siblings around admission to yeshiva high schools.
I cannot stress enough. I'm going to, feel like I'm going to try to say the same thing over and over in order to make that distinction. Someone who's struggling is, and that's something that's brought to the attention of the institution. I think that schools are compassionate places and they'll get response. That's generally not the way that it goes down. I think that even if I can kind of go back to the last exchange, a student who is who's struggling in in middle school and feels disconnected and not, and that is something that comes to the attention of a school, is very different. It's a very different circumstance than students who gather together to socialize around substances. And that is going to go back to the use and abuse distinction. I think that what gets schools anxious is when, and I think in our community this has grown a lot over the past 15 to 20 years, where our kids socialize around, earlier on it's now going to be, juuling, and then afterwards it's going to be alcohol and pot. And that is what generates that kind of anxiety, because if you think of it from a social perspective, it's actually, they're feeling very connected around that. And when kids are connecting around that, we have to figure out how to have kids connect around something else. And that's a very different circumstance than a student who feels disconnected and is resorting to substance, and that's brought to a school's attention. I think the school would react very differently.
All right, let's move on from schools, and we'll probably come back to them because it's such a critical issue if we have time. But I want to move on to a series of questions around precursors to addiction. And there were questions that perhaps Dr. Schulman, you can take the first crack at, around what could juuling and vaping lead to, what are the real dangers. Similar question, frankly, around marijuana, and gee, if I use a little bit of weed every couple of days and it helps keep me sane, what's the big deal? So let's try and address those and then move on to a couple more precursor questions.
Okay, so with regards to juuling, I'll just give a little explanation of what, I don't know if everyone in the room knows what a juul cigarette is, or an e-cigarette. Yeah, some people are shaking their heads. So it's a small device, it's electronic. Sometimes they look like a USB stick. They're very easy to hide, which is a big problem. I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. The way they work is they have a small reservoir of a liquid, and there's an electronic coil that vaporizes the liquid, and then the user inhales the vapor. You can put anything in the liquid, and there's legal juuls that are sold now that have nicotine, and there are many that are used that have marijuana as well. There's some filler as well, but I'm not going to go into the details. This is a serious problem for kids, and maybe you could probably speak about it as well. I'll just start talking, but you can add what you want to say. In 2016, there was a survey done in the United States, and 4.3% of middle school students and 11.3% of high school students reported that they had recently used e-cigs, meaning 1 in 10 kids was saying that they were using a product that likely contained nicotine. These are new products. They're easy to hide. Kids can use them in school. They don't smell like smoke. They're very easy to hide from your parents, very easy to hide from your teachers. I have patients that tell me that they use an e-cigarette product to smoke marijuana all day in school.
Can I interrupt? I feel so bad. That study was from 2016.
Mm-hmm.
I can only tell you locally here. Ask your kids. It is nowhere close to 4.3 or 11% in our schools.
It's much higher, is what I'd like to
Right.
say.
Sorry if that wasn't clear.
So it's a little scary, and it's much harder to test for it. It's much harder to tell. It used to be that when kids smoked marijuana, the parents could smell it. They would smell the smoke or whatever. I mean, kids can literally go to school all day long high, and no one will really know. I don't want to alarm everyone, but I'm just letting everyone know the reality.
I don't think it's so bad to alarm everyone, actually, on this one. Yeah.
And we know that nicotine, marijuana is a separate discussion, but nicotine certainly shouldn't be used by people below the age of 21, most likely. Do you want to speak more about it? Because I'm not a prevention expert.
I think, a few years ago, we were excited to see the number of youth using tobacco was decreasing, using leaf tobacco was decreasing, so cigarette sales were way down in our youth, and that was cause for a lot of excitement. But at the same time, the electronics were kind of sneaking in the back door. The Juul in particular is being marketed, so the Juul company is saying, as a cessation device for people who are longtime smokers. What's interesting about the product is it comes in flavors like mango and Fruit Loop and all kinds of, really flavors that would appeal to youth more than to somebody who was a 40-year smoker who was looking to quit. And so there's a lot of pressure on the Juul company right now to change their advertising, because it's clearly the marketing is working and youth are using these in increasing numbers. And I agree that the 11% is probably what the latest release number, but that it's not keeping up with the number of youth that are initiating with the product. And I think important to all of this, you spoke about groups of kids who initiate use, and maybe in social circles, and for some of them they may try these things and never try it again. It made them sick to their stomach, it didn't agree with them. There may be some kids that use it socially, only when they're with those groups, but for some kids it changes something. And those may be the kids that are struggling and didn't even realize how much they were struggling, and initiating any kind of substance changes the structure of their brains, and that may be the first time that young person felt normal. And so it could initiate things that in turn go to more serious drugs. So it might start as just nicotine, and then maybe the THC in marijuana makes them feel even better than that, and then maybe something along the line. We used to use the expression gateway drug, and it's kind of antiquated now, but it's still, we can speak to somebody who's struggling with a psychological problem in which they're self-medicating, and sometimes nicotine is really that first initiator.
What's particularly frightening about it is that it's a very high percentage of certainly younger adolescents who don't know what they're smoking, what they're inhaling. They think it's fruit flavors, and if you add even in the kind of the data points are, most of them are saying they do it for the fruit flavor. They don't know that nicotine is in there.
And we've been told there's a product available that's a hoodie, of which one of the strings actually acts as an inhaling device. And so a kid could be sitting in class with their hoodie on like this, inhaling the entire time, and the most experienced teacher in the world isn't going to figure that one out. An interesting question that arose, which is related to this, is, I don't think there's a problem. Should I be searching my kid's room? What should I be doing, around that? And maybe, Shelley, you could start with that one.
So it's interesting, too. There are many household items that could be used for drug purposes. And again, we don't want to frighten anybody. Finding spoons in your child's room could just mean that they're eating cereal or ice cream at night and leaving dishes, because I know under my kids' beds are typically things that shouldn't be there that should be in the kitchen. I would say what would be cause for alarm is finding several items that could be used together. I believe you also have a hidden in plain sight room. The hidden in plain sight room that we set up in different venues allows parents to see some of the things that can be used. So if you had a spoon with burn marks and steel wool, cotton balls, different things together, they might be cause for alarm, where one thing alone might not be. You as parents know your children better than anyone else, better than anyone in the world, and it's usually, there are signs that the child is showing in addition to things being found. So I always say you don't need to raid a child's room to invade their privacy if there's nothing indicating that there's a problem. But if there's a problem, maybe you go through the room together and say, to talk about what's going on. It could be household items, it could be things that are unrecognizable. The jewel, for instance, is, if it were plugged into the laptop, you might not know that it was anything but a thumb drive with school projects on it. And some parents are going in saying, what is this thing? I know this is a smoking device. And the kid's like, no, it's my homework. So having those conversations with kids is really the most crucial thing. And like I said, you as parents know, if something doesn't seem right, initiate that conversation and then maybe talk about some of the things that you're finding and asking what they are.
Can I just add that, at least in my view, at least as important as knowing what, or checking your children's rooms, is knowing where kids are going, which is becoming comfortable with the idea of calling your children's friends' parents and saying, are you going to be home? And they say they're going to someone else's house. Or if they say, I have this plan on a Saturday night, or this is what I'm doing for Simchas Torah, being extremely proactive and setting guidelines is really important to helping keep kids in line.
So one follow-up, and maybe Agent McMahon, you can take the first crack at this. Where are our kids? We all kind of think of our kids as these innocent, naive children. My two kids are in here, not you guys, but where are they getting the marijuana? How do they know where to buy it? And then a related question is, I know I've asked my kids this, and I think if all of you have high school age kids asked, do you know where to get drugs if you wanted them? And if you don't know where to get them, do you know who to ask where to get them? And the answer is almost always yes. So your kids are one conversation away from knowing who the dealer is. What can we do about getting these dealers outed so that we can do something about it?
I mean, again, the big thing is having these conversations with our kids, making sure, giving them an environment where they feel comfortable coming to you to talk about these things. Because again, even if odds are most of our kids are not involved, but if they go to school, especially in high school, guaranteed if they start asking around in the morning, by the end of the day, they'll know exactly who they have to go to buy whatever it is that they're looking to buy. As far as how do we get to the people that are selling, it's just getting that information of who is selling, reporting that to the school authorities or to law enforcement. I know I live out in Warren County. The school has a very good relationship with the local law enforcement in the area. A couple times my daughter has told me that the police were there today and they arrested a student for selling on campus. So it's just trying to get the word out there and have our kids. I know there's a stigma about, we don't want to be, I don't want to be the one that turns somebody in. There are ways that you can do it anonymously. You can just send a note to the school office, and then now it's on the school to take the necessary action.
Do our schools publicize that that's an option for our kids?
What exactly?
To be able to send an anonymous note to the school office to let them know that they know who's dealing to kids in the school.
I don't know about schools in general. I think that as part of kind of harassment training, we have like discussion like that, but I'm not sure that that's a norm around this topic in particular, no.
Okay. A couple of questions that came in around, abuse, substance abuse doesn't occur in a vacuum, right? How can we address co-occurring disorders, anxiety, mood disorders, eating disorders, environmental factors, peer pressure, things like that? What can we do better to address those issues, which, again, at least the askers of these questions, and I would agree with this, there's certainly a high correlation with substance abuse amongst those issues. So I don't know who wants to take that, but.
Well, one of the questions I saw from before the event was about prevention, and there's a question of discussing drugs with your kids. Maybe that will lead to more drug use. So I'd say that certainly discussing with kids or helping kids manage emotions from, as soon as they start school or before they start school won't lead to more drug use and will likely lead to less drug use and less problems later on in life. So I think, and I also think it would kind of work with our religious values if we talk about these things. I think a lot of the things that we talk about in shul are about how we deal with uncertainty in the world, how we deal with death, how we deal with failure, all sorts of things that if we try to take a more emotionally healthy approach, we maybe are a little more psychologically minded. I think we're doing a good job. I don't want to sort of sound like I'm saying that we're not doing this already. I happen to go to Netivat Shalom but Health God is very good about always being psychologically minded, but I think we can do more about prevention, and we can, in schools, probably do more in terms of dedicating more time to focusing on emotional health. My kids will spend a lot of time learning how to do math, but they don't really have anything to tell the kids how to deal with the fact when they get frustrated about the math homework. So what do you do with that? So it's up to, I'm a psychiatrist, so I try to do the right thing, but I think we all could get more, we could all be better. I could be better myself, and everyone could be better. And I think if the community would take that on in the school, in the shul, everywhere, that could certainly help prevent, we know that it helps prevent anxiety and more severe anxiety disorders as kids get older. There's good evidence to that. We know that it decreases depression, other more severe mental illness, and substance use.
I just want to add, I'm not the expert here, but there are numerous studies, and more come out by the day, that show that excessive use of technology is now considered to be a major cause of all sorts of anxiety, depression, withdrawal among teens and adults. And again, when we compare where we are now to where we were 10, 20 years ago, it's not just that the toxicity of marijuana is different, the entire landscape is different, our world is very different, and our kids are, on my impression, I don't know that there have been any studies, but it does seem to me as if the pressures that they face, there was a reference made earlier to a sixth grader being afraid of not being accepted into high school because of a confession of drug use. I'm willing to 100% accept Rabbi Harkstark's the way he treated that question, but the fact of the matter is there is a lot of pressure that sixth graders feel just if they're going to begin to get into high school, if their grades are high enough, or if they're in the high school of their choice. That's not the discussion for tonight, but if we're talking about, again, a culture and a community, one which promotes wellness and allows children to grow in a world that is not carefree and not worry-free, because that would also not be preparing them for adulthood, but in which we're able to protect them from an overload of stress and anxiety that they're not developmentally ready to handle. Again, I keep putting it back on all of us. All the experts in the world could say whatever they want. These are issues that we as a community need to accept, need to own, and need to decide whether or not we want to make changes.
So I want to shift gears now to, and I think that was a great segue into community responsibility. One question that I think Rabbi Rothbach, I'd like you to address first. We got a couple of questions with different flavors of this, but if addiction is a disease, what implications does that have for the individual's free will? So addressing that from a theological standpoint, and then also the other piece of this, which perhaps Dr. Schulman or Shelley, you can take a crack at, is, you know, what is it, are we kind of giving the sufferer an out by saying it's a disease, so I don't have to worry about it, there's nothing I can do about it? So I don't know if you want to address those issues.
Sure. So we know that one of the fundamentals of our beliefs, according to the Rambam, this is one of the Kari Amuna, that we believe that every person has free will, that a person can choose whether to do right, wrong, go this way, that way. And that is the basis of our entire existence. That's what makes our world as exciting and as frightening as it is. That is true. We also know, and you didn't have to come here tonight to hear this, that there are certain people, sometimes because of how God made them, and sometimes because of choices that they've made, that they either temporarily or permanently have their free will, at least in certain areas, completely suspended, obstructed. They cannot exercise free will. So to me, I don't think it's really so much of a theological question. The fact of the matter is, first of all, when we talk about addiction, there's a spectrum. So we wouldn't say that every addict has no free will. Certainly wouldn't say that. If anything, and again, I'm not the addiction expert over here, but I would say that if you really, really want to see the most glorious, amazing display of free will in the world, look at an addict who is reversing the trends of their behaviors. When you see a person who is in the throes of an addiction, who absolutely cannot function without feeding their addiction, and yet because of a commitment, because of a higher will, because of a desire to go ahead and to change their life, they go against every instinct that they have, sometimes with great personal pain and anguish, and to have to sustain that effort over the course of time, that is free will in its most fantastic form. So again, I don't think saying that an addiction is an illness is in any way a way out. I think it's an important message that we have to continue to spread and remind ourselves, because that will hopefully chip away at the stigma, a word that I don't believe has been mentioned once tonight, but it's one of the reasons why we're here. We're here because there is a stigma around a lot of these issues, and our talking about it and being open about it and calling it what it is, I don't think it's relieving anybody of personal responsibility. Treatment is a two-way street. Dr. Schulman would be the first to tell you, if somebody came into his office and said, I don't want to get better, I don't think you can continue to take their money.
I will. I'll tell you why I actually disagree with that, because and it's not that I just want money. I'll tell you that this is actually a very important point I want to make. The addiction world has developed in terms of how we think about treatment. There was a time when the approach was tough love, and if you're not ready for treatment, then get out of here. We're not interested in talking to you. There was a guy named Bill Miller in the early 1980s who came up with this new approach to treatment called motivational interviewing. He was actually a deacon. He was this very religious, spiritual guy. And he basically pointed out the obvious, and that is that people are ambivalent. If someone says to me, I don't want to change right now, and I believe I have lots of patients to tell me that. I have lots of patients that tell me I don't want to change, I want to change a little, maybe I'll change, then next time they want to change. People's desires kind of go up and down, and part of dealing with this is a chronic illness, part of dealing with the problem is accepting that there are moments when someone really is overtly saying they don't want to change. Even at the time when they say they don't want to change, part of them does want to change. And even when they say they want to change, part of them doesn't want to change. So it's about sort of understanding that people are complicated and we can work with them where they are. Sorry, I don't know, did I cut you off? I wanted to.
Like I said, I wasn't the addiction expert.
I wanted to, actually, I think that religiously, it fits, there's a point that I learned way before I became a psychiatrist, in sort of a later rabbinic thought, is Rabbi Dessler from Bnei Brak. He talks about how we don't really believe that in free will people can do anything they want. Meaning, the Rambam does say that anyone could be like a great big tzaddik, but he explains that like every person has a certain point where they can make choices in their life. Like we're at a certain place in our lives, and we can choose at that place to move maybe a little bit more towards getting better. And I think that that actually is a really important lesson. I think it's true in some religious thought, and I think it's really true in addiction treatment as well, that when we deal with people that are suffering, we work with them, and there's a lot of, everyone uses this phrase, we want to work with them where they're at, where they're up to, and we want them to move. I mean, even if the person says right now, I don't want to stop using, but if I can get the person to say, well, you know what, I'm going to stop using this much, or I'm going to at least think about the possibility of moderating my use, or I'm going to use in a safer way. So that's moving them at least a little bit more in that direction, and I think that that's really the answer to the question about free will. People always have some free will. The question is where that free will is manifesting itself. Yeah.
So staying with the theme of community, I have to ask this question. Should schools pledge to go dry to help educate the youth? Anyone want to tackle that one?
Agent McMahon?
One more time.
The question is so just to give you some background, very often at functions in synagogues on Saturday morning, there will be alcohol. The alcohol is served to adults, obviously, and I would say all of our synagogues here in town monitor the alcohol, meaning they're served by a person. There are precautions taking place that no one underage is getting any. I think the questioner is really questioning, are we setting a bad example for our children by serving alcohol at what effectively is a community function, and is that something that we should consider in terms of educating our youth refraining from?
Not knowing much about it. I mean, it's very similar in the Catholic Church as well. And you hear with families, when they're having dinner and, allowing their child to have maybe a small glass of wine with dinner. I don't necessarily think there's something wrong with that, or it's setting a double standard. Because it's the purpose isn't to drink to excess. I think once you start getting towards that point, then obviously that's where the issues start to come in.
Shelley, anything to add there?
I wanted to go back a little bit to the last
Sure.
conversation. From a public health standpoint, and I'm not a treatment professional, I'm primary prevention, my background is public health. When we look at the stigma around co-occurring substance abuse and mental health, I'm looking at everything from a primary prevention. If you compared it, because the brain is a part of our body, just like our pancreas and our kidneys and other parts of our body, if you looked at the general population and unhealthy diets, a certain percentage of the population might have a predisposition to type 2 diabetes, right? And so if we touted a healthy lifestyle for everyone, we don't know what we're preventing. We don't always know what we've prevented. It's hard to say. But we know that we may have prevented diabetes in a certain number of people by promoting a healthy lifestyle. And I think the same goes for substances. If we can prevent children from initiating substances, we don't know for sure what we're preventing, but we may be preventing the initiation of a mental health issue that may have been kept in a healthy check if the substance hadn't been initiated, if that makes sense.
I struggle a lot with the question of whether or not our shuls should go dry. I mean, the truth of the matter is I don't think about it all that much because it's really not in my control. I can really only directly have an influence on my own shul. And I know that already different shuls here in Bergen County have taken a position on this. And we really have, representatives really from every spectrum, every point along the spectrum as far as that is concerned. It would disappoint me if the only way that we can address this as a responsible way as a community is by retreating so much from alcohol that we can't model, as Agent McMahon just said, moderation, which is not just a healthy way of living, from a secular perspective, but it is very, very much very much a very important fundamental goal of every Jew, to be able to engage, to embrace, to indulge in this world, but to do so in a way that reflects moderation. But the fact of the matter is that we do have a percentage of our population that is predisposed, that will not necessarily be able to achieve that level of moderation quite as easy. And so then the question is, can we bring alcohol into our public facilities and only model in a way that is truly appropriate? I don't know the answer to that question. It puts a tremendous responsibilities on the individual institutions and the way alcohol is monitored. And the message that is shown, a term that I've used sometimes, which has offended people that are close to me, is glorified drinking. And they say, you know, when people get together and they enjoy scotch, which I happen, for full disclosure, not to enjoy, so, you know, I just don't like it. When I see people enjoying and talking for more than a couple seconds about what kind of scotch they're drinking and where they got it, you know, it rubs me the wrong way. I call that glorifying drinking. And people have really challenged me on that and said, you know, just because you don't get it, Rabbi, it's you know, it's like anything else in the world. It's something which fascinates us. It's a subculture, and there's, you know, there's a lot to get excited about. And no, we're not drunks. We're not alcoholics. We're in complete control. But at the end of the day, we know that many kids and adults are getting hurt in the process, and in the crossfire here. So I don't know. I really don't have an answer to the question.
Okay. So I want to ask one last question before getting into asking the panelists to each kind of wrap up. And the question is, our communities are wonderful at supporting people during so many of life's challenges. When someone has a child, these meal trains are established. They don't have to cook for like at least 3 weeks these days. I don't know, when we had our kids, it was only one. What can be done to encourage similar support for mental health and abuse crises? And I want to take the first crack at this one and then maybe turn it over to you, Rabbi Rothwax. I think we're doing it. I think that talking about mental health and talking about addiction for either someone who's suffering or a spouse or a parent is incredibly difficult. I don't take it lightly. I stand here before you only because I have an incredibly brave daughter who wants to pay back and help people. And I have an incredibly brave wife and incredibly brave other children who are willing to put themselves in the public spotlight for the greater good. And I don't take that lightly. It's not fair to expect, nor is it fair to even ask people who are suffering from these illnesses to come forward if they're not willing to do so. That being said, I do believe that our communal leadership in the schools, leadership in the shuls, are in a position to really help raise awareness and ensure that at least there's a comfort level in coming to communal leaders and saying, hey, we're suffering here, we can use some help. You know, when someone breaks a leg, everyone's lining up to say, let me drive carpool for you for the next 3 weeks. There are ways of saying, hey, I don't have a broken leg, but there's something else going on, I could use some help. And so I think that creating that type of communal awareness on the part of the leadership so that people do feel comfortable at least approaching communal leaders and saying, hey, we need some help here is a first step. I don't know if anyone has anything to add to that.
I think you just said it all. I think that speaking about it on a regular basis is probably the most effective way that we can chip away at the stigma. I will tell you that I find for myself personally, there is a natural tendency that I have to sort of slip back into the natural default setting that a lot of us have, and that is to view these types of struggles with a degree of prejudice. And I am somebody who, people who are very close to me have had certain mental health challenges. It's probably one of the reasons why I've become as sensitive as I am, or at least as more sensitive than I would have otherwise have been. But it is a constant challenge and requires a constant effort on my part to remind myself that just because a person is talking a certain way or acting a certain way doesn't mean that they are necessarily exercising, going back to what we said before, the sort of choice process that you and I, or somebody who doesn't have that struggle, would. And it's not enough to just have an event once or twice a year. It's something that we need to hear about and think about and talk about. We can never ask, certainly not demand, and expect that families like the Foremans come forward. It takes an incredible amount of courage and commitment and buy-in from every member of the family, and you really need to think long and hard before stepping forward in the spotlight as they did. But you will never know, ETL and Leanne and Ilana and the entire family, the tremendous impact that you have had in a way that none of us could have had, because here you are saying, we are one of you. You know, we go to the same shuls, our kids go to the same schools. There is nothing that we did. There was no flaw in our parenting. We're just like you. And yet we found ourselves in this situation. It could happen to anyone, and it does happen. And I think when more people step into the spotlight, it really makes a very strong, effective statement. So I think there's nothing more that we can be doing as a community. I would just say one other thing, and that is that should there ever be somebody in your shul, in your community, in your setting, wherever it is, who is either you know or somebody who's known to have struggles of this sort, a public, maybe literal, it depends on the circumstance and the relationship with that person, a public embrace of that person will go a long way in terms of not just making that person feel accepted, but conveying an important message to the rest of the community, and that is that this person is, deserves a place in here no less than anyone else. And we have to make those statements loud and clear.
With that, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to just give kind of a couple of minute wrap up. And one question I'd like you to think about as you wrap this up is what incremental goals you'd like to see from our community in terms of showing progress. I think Rabbi Rothwachs, you mentioned some of that, but you weave that into your wrap up. Why don't we start with you, Rabbi Hartsock, work our way down.
Sure. I've this evening tried to convey that as a high school principal, the addiction side is not my expertise. But focusing on adolescence, the lives of kids, and the ways in which they start to use is something that we I'm going to focus on a lot. I would want to draw everyone's attention here to, maybe if you can, to watch the 4-minute video when you get home. I think it'll work if you Google BBC and Iceland, and it might come up. And what they describe there is a project an experiment that took place in Iceland starting in 1996, where in Reykjavik they found when they start to gather data that 42.5% of the teens in Reykjavik had become drunk in whatever the question was, the last whatever, and they decided to embark on a plan which 18 years later resulted in the data gathering. They've been gathering data every year since then. That number was down to 5%. And the way in which they made those changes were a couple of strategies, which included doing surveys every year, asking parents to take pledges to be home earlier and know where their kids were, to have government invest in after-school activities, to create cultural change over the long haul. And when I watched that and kind of spoke to the people who ran that experiment and a similar kind of program out of the University of Washington, I found myself feeling like our tendency is I bring in a speaker and the kids hear it and I think that I've done my job. And in reality, what they did in that community was the hard work that involved all of the people, everyone, the whole community of parents and kids, not people who were suffering from addiction, but every family saying, we have to be in this. And it wasn't for 3 weeks or 6 months. It was 18 years for them to be able to make a difference. And in my experience, the use in our community of kids, the degree to which they are engaging in the use of alcohol and pot and now vaping is on the rise, even though in the United States it's actually on the decline. And that's a real worry. And what I would like to see is for us to engage in a public health effort to really not only feel this, empathy for people struggling with addiction, but actually to take upon ourselves the responsibility to try to make real cultural change within the Orthodox community. And my last sentences, in the interest of trying to start something like this, the first step is to survey, try to gather data, what's really going on in our community. And I'm pleased to say that 20 high schools mainly in the tri-state area and some other places have agreed to do this collectively, to try a process of saying what's really going on in our community so that we could know and then try to figure out intervention strategies to start shifting culture in a healthier direction.
Rabbi Rothwachs.
Thanks. I wanted to sit to the left. Listen, needless to say, agree with everything that Rabbi Hartsock said, and no doubt everything that the other panelists will say. I would just say a point that perhaps was not emphasized in my remarks tonight, but I would like to be more clear about it right now. We should be very mindful of the messages that we send our children, by the things that we say, by the things that we don't say, by the things that we do, by what motivates us, by what we get excited about. There are many, many messages that we are sending our kids. They are, believe it or not, even though it looks like they are constantly looking elsewhere, they are paying attention. We should be mindful of the demands that we are placing on our kids, of our stated or implied expectations of them academically. We should be mindful of the messages. I'm not telling you what their messages should be, but we should know that we are constantly sending messages to our kids. Although, as Rabbi Harksit just said, we are not necessarily having open dialogue with our kids, so they are not necessarily sure what it is that we really value, what it is that is important to us, what do we do if we're in trouble, what do we do if one of our friends are in trouble. I have found that with my own kids, and I obviously won't be specific in any way whatsoever in a public forum, but I can only tell you that broaching difficult topics with my children is one of the most difficult, challenging experiences for me personally. And once you cross that threshold and they let you in, it's the most amazing place to be. And it is very liberating for both of us. And it can be very, very effective. It's not something you could just do one and done. But having conversations with our kids, you can and we should talk to our kids about virtually everything, respecting, of course, that they deserve space and they deserve privacy. And no, we do not have a right to know every detail of their life and their social lives. That's not appropriate. It'll be counterproductive. But to bring them in to our worlds and to try to allow them to enter theirs. And this will definitely go a very, very long way in terms of changing the culture in our community and seeing to it that hopefully when we gather for such similar events in the future, as I'm sure we will, we'll be able to speak about progress, measured progress that we've been able to see and detect in our community.
Dr. Shulman?
So actually, this one thing I feel like I need to say. It's not very inspiring, but I feel like I have to tell everyone because I've been sort of an addiction psychiatrist, my gospel. And it has to do with treatment. We didn't get a chance to talk about treatment. This is not really wrapping up. This is just something I feel like I have to tell as many people in the world as I can. I happen to be talking to a lot of people. And that is about opiate use disorder and heroin treatment. We didn't talk about treatment really at all, but there's a lot of misinformation in this area, and I just want to sort of say something very clearly. With many substances, you can treat substance use disorder with talk therapy, with AA groups, NA groups, whatever type of therapy it is, it's fine. It happens to be with opiate use disorder and heroin. There was the NIDA is the National Institute on Drug Abuse. It's this government organization that studies these things that we get a lot of our grant money from. So they did a very big study where they looked at opiate use disorder, and they took more than 600 patients that had a problem with pills, pain pills, and they tried to just use talk therapy to treat them. And I don't know, I'm not going to ask everyone to guess, but what percentage of those people after a month we're still not using opiates? The number was about 5%. So 95 out of 100 people went back to using the drug. When they put them on a medication to help them with opiate use disorder, the number went down to about 50%. So it went from 1 in 20 people not using drugs to 1 in 2. So, and the reason I'm taking my sort of closing remarks to talk about this is because opiate use disorder is a really serious disorder. 1 in 50 people die of opiate use disorder if they're not treated a year. It's the reason we have the opiate crisis in this country. It's the reason why opiates kill more people than car crashes or gun deaths. So if you or anyone you know, or anyone you heard about has opiate use disorder, you should, I would suggest that always try to find a program, find treatment that will include medications as well. Not a very inspiring message, but a message that I feel like every time I read an article about someone dying of an overdose death from heroin after they were in a rehab and they're not on medication, and I think I have to tell more people about this, and there's national organizations that are trying to tell everyone. If people are doing well for years, it's something else, but if they're having an active problem, they should be on medication. And I also just wanted to say thank you to the foremans. And I guess for the community, I just would say that I'm trying to help as much as I can. The foremans are doing probably like 100 times more work in the community than I am. If more people could do more, there's a lot of causes and there's obviously a lot of values we have, but the more manpower we have and the more effort we have towards prevention and treatment and education, the better. So let's just get out and do more.
Special Agent McMahon.
And just be aware that this problem is out there. You know, it doesn't matter where you live, what income bracket you're in. This is an issue that is affecting everybody, every community from coast to coast. Again, I go out and I do a lot of educational presentations. I deal with a lot of parents whose children have been affected by drug use. It's very important that if the time comes that you do find out that your child is doing something, as easy as it is to say, it is very important to remain calm. You don't want to fly off the handle, because then odds are they're just going to shut down and they're not going to speak to you. It's very important, as I said earlier, to make sure that they're aware that they can come to you. Very important that they have that comfort level with you. Don't ever think that this is something that happens to everybody else, that it's not going to happen to my child, because it does. As parents, we can do everything the right way. We can have the conversations with our kids about the dangers, keep them involved in the extracurricular activities so they don't have all that downtime. Things still happen. Very important to be aware of that. And then just to finish up, it's very inspiring to see how many of you came out tonight. I thank you very much for that. For those that weren't able to make it, please take some time during the week and speak to your friends and just let them know what we spoke about tonight, and keep that conversation going with the rest of the community. So thank you very much.
Sean?
All of those things. I have 3 children, and 2 of them have made reasonably good choices. My twins are 24 now, and my oldest child made some difficult choices that made his life hard for a while. He's since cleaned those choices up and is doing well out in California. But I think to Agent McMahon's point, for as many families as we have here, there are that many stories, and every family has a different story. If I can say one thing though, in this world of technology and of easier lives because of that technology, sometimes our kids lose a sense of purpose. And for as many activities as we have them in, altruism is an important part of keeping kids knowing what their purpose is. They can be very involved in activities that are very centered around them. But sometimes we need to focus that onto something else. And when children have a purpose and we introduce them to leadership and to civic mindedness, that can make a big difference in the life of those children as well.
Thank you. I just want to call on Leanne, who apparently has something she wants to say.
Don't I always? So first of all, I just want to say I'm usually not the one that speaks, only because my husband is much more polished, can think quicker, doesn't talk with his hands like I do. So he has been at the last 2 events, this one and the one in April, the face of what we have to say. It was not easy for us to do this, and I know people who are close to me and I know people who are not close to me can appreciate that. My personal feeling is seeing the number of people in this room I'm embarrassed by all the things that were said. I appreciate it, but I'm embarrassed by it. But seeing the number of people in this room and knowing that the community cares about this, that it's not just me personally that you're supporting, that we're trying to act together as a unit is incredibly touching. And now I'm going to do something that I hope nobody hates me for. There are about 50% more questions that came in. We did not touch on trafficking. We did not touch on local resources that Shelley can talk about. There were more questions about schools. There were questions about what is addiction, why do some people get addicted, some don't. The dangers of prescription drugs. There were a ton of questions that came in that were great, and we're sorry that we couldn't get to them all, but I'm going to ask if I can ask you to answer specific questions via email at your convenience. We have a website. The questions that come in anonymously. I just want to stress that. So if you submit a question via our website, it will be anonymous. We will not know who submitted it. But if we can we're going to have a link up to this event up on the website at some point when we're ready to post it, and people will be able to see it then. But also, I think if we can post the answers to a lot of the questions that were not addressed tonight and that I think are pressing for people to get answered, that would be appreciated.
All right. Two quick thank yous I missed. Lisa Weiner also just did a phenomenal job helping us organizationally with this event, and our volunteer photographer, Abe Spector-Kovitz, thank you so much. Appreciate it. To our panelists, thank you. I've never moderated a panel before, so I had no idea what to expect. Apparently I overshot by about 50% as to what I thought we'd be able to accomplish. But thank you all for your candid, thoughtful remarks. And really the thanks goes to everyone out here. We are a community, and we will only be able to address this issue if we act as a unified community. Please, please, please fill out the feedback card so we know what we can do to help the community next. We would like to continue to do that if, to the extent that there are things the community wants. If anyone wants any updates on our other initiatives, if anyone knows somebody who could benefit from the support group, please reach out to us. If anybody wants more information on what's going on with the schools, please reach out to us. And then finally, again, there are envelopes there. If people are able to help defray the cost of this event and future events, there's a box in the back where you can just put a check in the mail if you prefer. Not bad, only 15 minutes late this time. Thank you all for coming out. Very much appreciate it.